I'm Cody Daigle-Oriens, and welcome to StoryFest 2020. Due to the ongoing impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, StoryFest 2020 is going virtual. From September 15th through September 29th, StoryFest will premiere 13 live and pre-recorded author events, featuring top authors and creators in genre fiction, comics, young adult fiction, and middle grade fiction. This year, we have over 50 authors joining us from all across the country, and in cross-genre panels, they will explore the big ideas at the heart of telling stories in today's world. Even though we can't welcome you to the library's forum in person, we're glad to have you with us virtually. Thanks for being here, and enjoy StoryFest 2020.
Gwendolyn Kiste is the Bram Stoker award-winning author of The Rust Maidens, and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, the dark fantasy novella Pretty Marys All in a Row, and the occult horror novelette The Invention of Ghosts. Her latest novel, Bone Set and Feathers, comes out this fall. Michelle Renee Lane writes dark speculative fiction about identity politics and women of color battling their inner demons while falling in love with monsters. Her short fiction appears in the anthologies Terror Politico, A Screaming World in Chaos, The Monstrous Feminine, Dark Tales of Dangerous Women, The Dystopian States of America, Graveyard Smash, and Dead Awake. Her Bram Stoker Award-nominated debut novel is Invisible Chains. Elle Marie Wood is an award-winning author and screenwriter. She is the recipient of the Golden Stake Award for her novel The Promise Keeper, as well as the Harold L. Brown Award for her screenplay Home Party. Her short story, The Ever After, is part of the Bram Stoker Award finalist anthology Sycorax's Daughters. Wood was recognized in the Mammoth Book of Best New Horror, Volume 15, and as one of the 100-plus Black women in horror fiction.
I'm so excited to be sitting here having a conversation with you ladies about vampires, of all things. One of our favorite things, I'm sure. So let's just jump right in. You know, when I think of vampires, or when most people think of vampires, the image that comes to mind is like Bela Lugosi in black and white and staring into the screen and attempting to make us bend to his will, especially if you like the classics, of course, right? Nosferatu skulking up the stairs. These are images we all, can identify with readily. My personal favorite rendition to hit the silver screen was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Have you seen that version? Mm-hmm. In the 90s? Love it, right? Nothing beats reading the original Stoker tale, though. Nothing at all. Even though it wasn't the first vampire story ever written down, it's the one that comes readily to mind for everybody. Most people, if you ask what vampire, it's story at least, it's that one. So what vampire story has touched you, though? What made you want to use that antagonist in your own writing? Were you always a vampire fan? Did the idea to work with vampires just pop into your head? And when it did so, was it Nosferatu or was it another? Michelle, you want to go first?
Sure. So I started reading vampire fiction when I was about 11. And before that, I was watching, I watched Bela Lugosi in Dracula. And Saturday afternoons, I would watch Hammer horror movies. And my favorites were the Dracula movies with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And so I feel like I had a really early introduction to vampires, and I'm not really sure what it was about them at the time that attracted me, but I don't know, I sort of developed that love early and it's never gone away. So I tried to read as much and see as much as possible. So the first books that I read were Anne Rice's books, and from there, I just started consuming as much as possible because I could not get enough vampire fiction. And it was an obsession, and I think it still is. Yeah.
I think that's true for all of us who really, you said, if you say Lestat, that's enough, right?
Yeah, right? Yeah.
I think any one of us who's been introduced to Lestat never truly gets over it. Gwendolyn, what do you think?
I have to go with Hammer and Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. That was not my first introduction to Dracula. The first was definitely the Bela Lugosi version. I remember seeing that probably when I was like 4 or 5. I mean, it's like one of those memories. I can't even say like how old I was. I was very, very little. It just seems like it was always there. And I liked that version, and it was a lot of fun. But it was something about the Hammer version, Horror of Dracula, that first one with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, that I just love so much. Like literally, the DVD of it is sitting out right now upstairs by our TV, because I rewatch it periodically, and it's just like it pretty much just stays out all the time because it's so lush. It's got that Technicolor. It's so different than the Bela Lugosi version, even though they were really only, I think, about 25, less than 30 years apart, but they feel like they're worlds apart. Mm-hmm. And I loved Christopher Lee as Dracula. I love Peter Cushing. It's just so much fun. And then from there, I remember seeing an interview with the vampire in theaters. I don't think I've ever read the book, which is probably something I should not admit in a vampire panel, but now that I've admitted it, now I need to. But I remember seeing the movie version, and I was really little. Like I was like probably 10, and my parents took me to the theaters to see it. But I loved it. They knew, like, we all loved horror in my family, and I loved that version. And then I saw Bram Stoker's Dracula. And even though I have some problems with Bram Stoker's Dracula, because I don't like Gary Oldman as Dracula in it. I feel like I'm the only one. I know. You guys are going to kick me off the panel, but I'm like the only person who feels that way. I love the costumes in it. I love like the presentation of it, but I think I don't buy like his and Winona Ryder's chemistry. I think for me, there's something there that I don't quite buy it. And I feel like that's where I get lost, but I love Sadie Frost as Lucy in that version. I love her. And so I always would go back to that just to watch her again. And so that's definitely been a big inspiration for me. I know now you guys are going to be like, off the panel, you don't like Gary Oldman as Dracula. I know.
I'm having a hard time speaking. I need a breath. I don't know. I just need a second.
You know, the good news is there are so many Draculas to choose from. I mean, you can't go wrong. There are just so many good Draculas out there.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, an Interview with a Vampire, by the way. I mean, the movie. Oh, my gosh. The cast. Mm-hmm. The whole cast. Just fantastic. I saw it in the theater myself a couple of years ago. I saw it before when it came out, but then a couple of years ago, I saw it again on the big screen. There's nothing like it, right? It's just fantastic. Yeah. Antonio Banderas? Come on. Come on.
Famous, like that's what's so great. And like little Kirsten Dunst, she's so good as Claudia. She's so little. And
I know, gosh.
Yeah, that whole cast is so good. It's such a fun movie. And I always go back and think, I bet this time it's gonna feel dated or something, but it never does. I still think it works as well now as it did when it came out. I
right.
Really like that.
Even though we know a whole ton more about the actors that were in the movie now, it doesn't matter. Some things are actually revealed, so. Frankly, really good movie. I'm glad you brought that one up. So since we're talking, Gwendolyn, I have a cute little sentence. I'm going to read it here. You've dipped your toe into the blood more than once. I'm proud of myself for that. I just like that I wrote that sentence. So you dipped your toe into the blood more than once. Your stories, Relationship Status and Of Blood and Men, feature vampires on opposite sides of the spectrum. Romantic comedy on one, and the more somber side of the human existence on the other, that is otherness, really, on the other. How do your vampires break the mold, originally cast by Polidori, Dumas, Le Fanu?
I try to think about, kind of modern sensibility, even when I'm writing things that maybe are based a little bit before. And I love that. How did you even know that I wrote those vampire stories that long ago? Those are like deep cuts from years ago. I'm very impressed.
That's research right here.
Wow, because I'm like, whoa, she's going into the deep cuts.
Like my shirt says writer, but I should have one that says researcher.
Yeah, so because the Blood and Men, that was like my third published short story, I think, and it's actually a Dust Bowl story. So I thought it would be interesting to take. So maybe that one's not so modern as it was at looking at that particular setting. And I thought during the Dust Bowl, because I researched it, and it's such an intense era of American history. And I thought how interesting it would be for a vampire because there would be no sun out and they wouldn't have to breathe out in a dust storm. And so it's like, how would the environment sort of change what it would be like to be a vampire? And so I felt like, building on what the kind of Gothic sensibilities are, we know what they look like in castles. What do they look like in other kinds of settings too? So that's kind of something I like to bring to it. Because like we said, there's so many different ways to approach vampires. I think that's one of my favorite things about this kind of, I don't even call it a trope. It is a trope, but I feel like that undercuts it a little bit and makes it sound bad. We always say trope and we think it's bad. And I think vampires keep coming back because we can do so much with them and every person can bring their own experiences and their own ideas to them. And it's such a malleable kind of subgenre of horror.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I prefer to consider them as the antagonists they are, as opposed to the trope of, writing vampire fiction. Because then in that way you can see the flexibility and how different they can be. And instead of just sort of labeling them in the other way. This trope does have a negative connotation to it. It almost feels like it's done and redone and kind of tiresome. But vampires are like every bit not tiresome. They're the opposite of tiresome. So yeah, no, very nice, very nice. Well, Gwendolyn, you too, about Invisible Chains. I mean, it was nominated for a Stoker Award. So let's, first of all.
Yeah.
But it works with vampires in an unusual way. Like it's a partnership formed between the living and the undead in this magical soup of supernatural creatures, an escape from slavery, primal fear. I just, how did you craft your vampire differently than what's been heretofore found in traditional vampire fiction?
That's a really good question. So I guess what I wanted to achieve with my vampire was to make him complicated, because I think vampires are complicated. At least they can be. He is not a hero. And I think the thing that I wanted to really address, I read a lot of romantic vampire fiction, and I feel like a lot of the vampires that we're seeing in contemporary romantic fiction are portrayed as sort of heroes in a way. They are the romantic leads. They are viewed as ideal mates. They take girls to prom. And in a lot of ways, these narratives tend to normalize violence towards women. At least that's how I've been reading them. And I did not want to write that kind of vampire for my story, especially since, my protagonist is, she's a young slave and she is constantly surrounded by violence. But it's coming at her from humans. It's coming at her from her situation, being enslaved. And so the vampire he tends to be violent with his victims, but he tries not to act that way with her, because I think he sees what's going on around her. And I think he's trying to befriend her, try to convince her that he is in some way safer than her situation. He tries to talk her into becoming like him because he believes that then she'll be somehow safer, have more power. But I wanted to make sure that he was a monster. Like, I did not want him to come across as someone that she wanted to end up with, because I think that's a problem. I don't think it's okay to go to prom with a vampire. I mean, yeah, it would be really super cool. And if I were back in high school and got to go to prom with a vampire, that would be like, I wouldn't have to ever do anything after that, because that would be like the greatest thing ever. Because I'd be like, told you. So anyway, I don't know. I think that my goal was to make sure that he was a monster, and that's how you would be viewing him. Yeah.
I mean, I can't help but agree with that. I think that, I saw something, I think it was on Disney, I could be guessing, I can't remember, but I was so blown away by the storyline. The zombie was dating the cheerleader, but there was talking. I kept thinking, I mean, you get hung up on silly things, right? But I was like, the zombie is dead. It can't speak. This, like, well, don't take some of the stuff away. You know, some stuff should remain. And I feel the same way with just the whole, yes, vampires can be used in different manners, but they are monsters. They're monsters, you know? Yeah. And there's that whole logical discussion and debate that goes back and forth about, you know, you can look at, if we want to talk about, you know what, indeed, I'll talk about that now. Metaphorical vampirism. You know, I think that that's kind of coming up more as society changes, as the world changes, and we see different things, and certain understandings of psychological behavior are more readily understandable now, or defined now. I shouldn't say understandable, but defined now. So we've kind of moved into this sort of metaphorical vampire that feasts upon what critical analysis deems popular. So imagine Llewellyn Miller. Do you know the story? Mary Wilkins Freeman. She wrote the story about an energy, a demon, a vampire that focused on like energy as a vampire. She was taking the energy of the people around her. Okay. That's what it was not blood sucking. It wasn't anything like that. It was more focused on energy and psychic energy and that sort of, you know, again, metaphorical vampirism. So has that side ever appealed to you when you're doing your writing? I mean, you know, there's a whole idea of being a traditionalist, but have you ever thought, because some of what you just said, Michelle, leads into some of the more sociological topics that are going on around the world, and in which case I think metaphorical vampirism has a place. It can be applied to certain things. So the question is, has the metaphorical side ever appealed to you in terms of writing your vampirism? Has there ever been an avenue you've explored that can either explained with the vampire label, or do you feel more firmly rooted in the literal vampire that we know and love?
I tend to write more about literal vampires. I feel like sometimes their behavior mimics other things. Like I think that it was really important to me to have a vampire in a story about slavery, because it's really, I mean, I felt like slavery itself drained the energy of, I don't know, millions of people, and they were, you know, on a daily basis had the life sucked out of them. And in some ways transformed them into something that they weren't. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I prefer a literal vampire in a story, and I feel more comfortable writing about literal vampires. But I think that, again, like you were saying, Gwen, you can use them in so many ways and put them in so many different settings, that even if they are a literal vampire, they can be so many different things. So, yeah, I don't know. I've never tried the idea of using like a psychic vampire. I've had other types of creatures like demons or, you know, fallen angels, siphon energy from people. But typically my vampires are blood drinkers.
I love it. Well put. Typically my vampires are the quote of the day. Well put. Gwendolyn, what do you think? Have you ever dipped your toe into that?
Not really. I'm kind of of the same idea. Like I like the idea of it, but I just never really found a place in my own work. Like I've been thinking through it. I'm like, it's mostly the literal kind of vampire. I feel like it can work like you were saying, so much in this metaphorical way unto itself of being able to show things that, because people do this to each other. There are so many different ways that we hurt each other and we drain the life out of one another. And you know, that's another reason why your book is so great. Yay, Invisible Chain. Seriously, it's such a brilliant book. It's such a brilliant book.
Thank
you. So I think that speaks to, again, how malleable vampires are. And to me, I feel like the literal vampire is I use almost in that metaphorical way. And now I'm trying, now that this conversation's going on, I'm like, maybe I need to kind of look at the metaphorical vampire and try to like play with that a little bit more, because that isn't something I've done in my writing at this point. But I've seen some other things where people have, and I think it definitely is kind of, again, a wide open area of still looking at the vampire, you know, as this kind of character that we can continue to go back to and continue to reimagine. But not yet for me, but definitely interested to see, you know, what other people are doing and maybe exploring that at some point.
Well, you know what, now that we're at that point in the discussion, I wonder if you think about the metaphorical vampire, it takes it to be, you're now having social commentary.
Mm-hmm.
And once you're doing a lot of social commentary, you kind of pull away from the idea of being fiction and escapism and, you know, sort of entertaining in that way. And now you're commenting on real world things. Now, mind you, I know we all agree that sometimes life imitates art or art imitates life. Now you don't know which one is true. You know, right? 2020, we don't know which way it's actually going. Did someone write this down and we're acting it out now or what? But in that way, I wonder, just do you think that writing a metaphorical vampire, you know, applying what a vampire does, all the things that we know to be true about the classic vampire, and then some of the things we might have, you know, can sort of deduce from just a logical review of whatever the topic might be. You know, you spoke of, you know, abuse. One could even apply it to drug abuse. You know, just we could go as far as we want to with it. But does that then change the focus of that vampire from being a character for a vehicle for entertainment to being a vehicle for change? And in that way, how does that change us as writers? Gee, that's a hard question, huh?
Well, I would argue to a certain extent that vampires have always functioned as standing in the place of something else. So like even if like you go back to Bram Stoker's Dracula, that's written in the time of Empire by an Irishman in England. And so you have this outsider coming from a foreign country invading, which is the opposite of what the British were doing all over the globe. And so, you know, there was a lot of fear in the Victorian psyche about, you know, what happens if the tables are turned? Like what happens if, you know, we're invaded here in our small island, and, you know, what happens to our women? And Dracula literally comes, he buys property, he sets himself up, he starts helping himself to the women, immediately as soon as he gets there. And so he becomes this symbol for the fears that are already existing in Victorian culture. So I would say that they've always kind of functioned that way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah. Was there anything you wanted to add to that? Yeah.
I would completely agree with all of that, because that was actually what I was going to say. I was going to say so much of the original Dracula is kind of about xenophobia. Even though I feel like what's so great about the Dracula character is, you know, you can rewrite him to be a lot of different things, but I do think that initially it was about xenophobia. Like you said, as soon as he gets there, he immediately goes after Lucy. And so it is this kind of fear of the other, of the outsider. And then I think also as time has gone on, this is a little bit in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but I think other people have played on it more. It's sexuality. It's the fear of sexuality. It's also the embrace of sexuality. And so I very much agree with Michelle. I think that that kind of commentary is almost built in. So when I'm writing, I'm always trying to think, can somebody kind of just come into my story? And I always like to have the idea of, can it just be entertaining? Can it just be entertaining? Like, even if, you know, I want the social commentary in there, can it just be enjoyed as entertainment, you know, on the surface? If somebody's like, I don't want that, I don't want this kind of social message, you know, why wouldn't you? Is what I always want to say. But you know what? Like, maybe you want your escapism and it is vampires. So having it be able to operate on that level, but then always if somebody wants to kind of look at it, I think vampires are such a great, again, vehicle. I know I keep saying that, I sound like a broken record, but I love them so much because I've written vampire stories, but I've also read so many vampire stories, and it's amazing how you can go to different ones, and each one is so different. And so I think that you can just kind of, they are this sort of blank slate in terms of what you want them to represent, and you can bring that commentary in. But somebody knows, hey, it's a vampire story, and you can just take it kind of as on the surface of being a vampire story.
I would agree with you. The blank slate is a really good idea, because more so than like werewolf or zombie or mummy or anything. You know, you kind of have to stay within the lines there. You can't really color too much outside the lines there. But with vampires, it can be anything, honestly. So, you know, let's talk about that. Why do we think that vampires have endured so well? The classics, because even as we see the changes that people make, people still kind of lean on a lot of what we know from the past. And I think I consider myself a traditionalist, even though because I've tested writing a vampire that's not traditional to know that I think I like it the other way. Why do we think, why do they endure? What is it about a vampire? I mean, it's an undead being that gets up and bites your blood, just sucks your blood, bites you on the neck, sucks your blood. That's what it is. Can't go out during the day, you know. Now they're shimmering. I don't know. Well, I don't know if we can add that in later. That's for a later discussion. But they've got beautiful skin because it shimmers in the light, you know. But the traditional vampire is, you know, a bloodsucker.
Right.
You know, so why does that endure? There are lots of things to scare us. Why would that stick?
Huh.
I think there's the romanticism of the immortality that can bring people in. There is this kind of idea of like, I think a lot of people, not everybody obviously, but you know, a lot of people, if you think about death, you might fear death, you might wonder, you know, what happens. This gives kind of an answer to that. And also this idea of like, there's a little bit of that romantic element of not only do you get to live forever, you're not like a zombie that you're decaying the whole time. You know, most vampires look pretty good still. So it's like, you know, that can be something that even though they're terrifying, they can kind of draw us in, and not just with this kind of thrall that vampires have, but with these elements of being like, oh, you're dead, but it's maybe not so bad as being like a zombie again, which there's not much romantic, like you said, about zombies. I think that's why it's like, you know, that's, I love zombie movies. I love zombie stories, but there's nothing romantic about it. Whereas you can see how someone might be able to turn them. I'm not a big romantic vampire person because like Michelle was saying, I think it can get really toxic, especially for women, because it can be this thing of like, oh yeah, this guy. And it's like, no, that's not, even though I agree, like going to prom with a vampire would be cool, like the idea of it, but it wouldn't really be cool, you know?
If at the end I have to give you some bloods, well, I don't want that. I don't want this face.
Right. Great. Well, I mean, I feel like I think about this way too much, but I guess the thing is that for me, if I want to read something that's like, you know, going to provide me some escapism, that's what I'm going to dive into is romantic vampire fiction, because it's hot. I mean, you know, the vampires are super sexy. The sex is completely fictional. I mean, I can't imagine like some of the things that are happening in these novels that it's just like, okay, yeah, that's the fantasy element. And but they're really enticing. I mean, because they are attractive, they have money, they have access to unimaginable wealth, they have all kinds of power, and they're connected. And, you know, I wrote something recently where I argued that, you know, the modern vampire, their most terrifying power is their white privilege, because they have access to everything. So, you know, nothing stops them. And so, you know, I've been talking a lot about like the Souls Trilogy by Deborah Harkness, and her vampire, Matthew Claremont, is probably one of the scariest vampires in romantic fiction in a long time, because he is extremely dangerous and has nothing can stop him. I mean, he walks in daylight. He has wealth beyond your comprehension. He has a private army.
Wow.
Yeah, he's like the Rosetta Stone for white privilege. And so he's terrifying because of those reasons, but he's also terrifying because he really is a vicious vampire. Other vampires are afraid of him. Plus, he has this rare blood disorder that sends him into a blood rage that makes him incredibly dangerous to be around, whether you're human, vampire, or whatever you are. But going back to that whole idea that you were talking about, Gwendolyn, about this idea of like rampant female sexuality, and how in a lot of ways, there's this idea that needed to be contained in the Victorian ideal. And so what's interesting to me is that a lot of the early romance novels that had vampires in them, the idea was to sort of like open up and release that. And so, there was a lot more experimentation, and the female protagonist had more control over their sexuality, and were making decisions for themselves. And so it wasn't as strict. But what's interesting about some of the more popular vampire fiction, like the Souls Trilogy and the Twilight Saga, the main vampires in those stories are constantly trying to control the sexuality of their partner. So in one way or another, they're seducing them and enticing them by showing an interest in them, but they're also kind of keeping them in this holding pattern around sex. So, in the Twilight Saga, Bella and Edward don't have sex until after they're married, which doesn't happen until the fourth novel. And so, and the entire time while she keeps trying to change his mind, he keeps putting her off. Matthew Claremont and Diana Bishop, they kiss and they have oral sex, but they don't have intercourse after they're married. And that happens in the middle of the second book. And this is romantic vampire fiction that has a really strong hold on female sexuality.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about sex now. So sexy or scary? Which one do you prefer to write? Right? I mean, I'm like, we're here. Which one do you prefer to write? How about you, Gwendolyn? While you're laughing and I've made you blush over that one.
I like scary vampires. I do. I go back and forth with the sexy vampire. Like there's part of me that really likes it, because I mean, I would say Interview with a Vampire, that's sexy vampires. They're scary too, but come on, like especially in the movie, they're Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. Come on, yeah. Like they're definitely going for the sexy angle there. Yes. I do love that movie, but I even when I think of that movie, I think of the points when they're actually really scary. And Lestat is actually very scary for a few moments, like not the whole time, but there are some really like a lot more than I would have expected from Tom Cruise. Yeah, back then, like I was like, oh, you can be really, really scary. Which maybe we know that now, but we didn't know that then. Right. But yeah, I think I like scary vampires. I think of the movie Near Dark. I love that movie. That's like such a they're awful in that. They're not sexy. Like they're not sexy vampires. They're scary vampires, and I do like that. But then again, I love The Lost Boys too, and that kind of toes the line between sexy and scary, because they're a little bit sexy, but they're definitely scary. So maybe I'll just say something like that I like when you kind of blend them both. That way I don't have.
When you're writing though, do you blend them or do you?
I think I use some of the occasion I've used some of the sexier elements, but trying to subvert them and trying to say, we know that this is here, but sometimes this can take away the agency, especially like we were saying, of the female characters. Very often they lose their agency when they're using that kind of sexual thrall. So a lot of times I will acknowledge it, but not necessarily be like, yay, sexy vampires, more like scary vampires. I think vampires scare me more than I think they're sexy. If I had to choose, I would definitely go with the scary.
Interesting. Okay. How about you, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's a toss-up. I mean, most of the time when I'm writing about vampires, they're never unattractive. I'll say that. which I think in some ways is what makes them scary, because
Yeah.
you are not repulsed by them
Yeah.
until you get a little closer and you figure out what they are, or what they're up to at least. And so yeah, I mean, I feel like I tend to write vampires that are attractive. So yeah, I'm more of a sex vampire fan, I guess. But I also am not clueless to the fact that they are really terrifying creatures. And so yeah, I'm sort of halfway. I'm sort of like halfway, because I do want my vampires to be scary. And Near Dark is one of my favorite movies. I think it was like one of the first times that you actually got to see what vampires would be really like if they were living in our world, and it was not great. It was terrible. And I would not want to run into them because they were really terrifying. But yeah, I mean, most of my vampires that I write about, you would not kick them out of bed for eating crackers. So yeah.
That's so great.
Like, I didn't see her coming with that one. That was great. I have to agree, though, when I write vampires, they are attractive, because if something terrifying or shows me its true nature is standing there, I'm just going to run, get away from it. I'm not going to be involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
The story starts and ends with me seeing it. It's over.
Right.
So if we want the story to continue,
Mm-hmm.
it's got to be good looking. So
Mm-hmm.
I lean much more, well, I guess it's the combination, but it's heavier on the sexy. The scary will manifest itself. Sure, it's a vampire, but he's good looking. Or she's good looking. It doesn't matter. They are good looking. They're handsome and beautiful. One of them, it doesn't matter. All right. So, I mean, all right, let's talk about this. We've talked about vampires being malleable, and we really enjoy them as an antagonist. And we read and we write vampire fiction. So, but my vampires don't shimmer, right? I don't know. I thought it was cool, but not for me, right? It didn't happen that way. I like the books, don't get me wrong, but just for me, I'm not gonna then say, oh, I'm gonna make them, no, that didn't work. But my vampires don't always hide from the sun either. Mm-hmm. So it depends upon my mood, right? And there's that freeing sense of rewriting the rules in this space, I think, because we are dealing with such a classic, but it's such a versatile classic, right? Mm-hmm. So how have you added to the vampire canon in that way? What, characteristic would you say that permeates your writing that can now be listed as one of the things? Because the shimmering is there, like it or lump it, right? What do you add? What have you dreamt up? Or could we dream up something now and list it as something that this vampires can do this?
I would say for me, I believe the last vampire story I wrote was The 8 People Who Murdered Me, excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary. So it's from the perspective of Lucy, because I'd never seen that done. And even before I wrote it, I actually searched and was like, somebody had to have done this before, and I couldn't find anything. And so I was like, okay, like this is something that I feel like, I could do that I've never seen done, and I couldn't find anywhere. So maybe that, just having that kind of, there have been things from Renfield's perspective, there have been things from Nina's perspective, but I couldn't find really anything from Lucy's perspective. And so that was something that I was really excited to explore, because I always loved Lucy. And I don't think she gets nearly enough time in the book, and she's like my favorite character in the book. She still wants to do things her way. She's just like, whatever, I want to marry 3 men. Why can't I marry 3 men? Right. Like, I love that so much, like, especially in the Victorian age. She's just like, I like all of them. Why do I have to choose? Who says I have to choose? That's great.
It was awesome, actually. Nice. Okay. Michelle?
I don't know. I'm working on a short story right now. And it's set on the set of an adult film. And this vampire is obsessed with Josephine Baker, and because of her, And his co-star in this adult film really reminds him of her. And so he's going to do some really crazy things to try to convince her to become like him, because Josephine refused. So yeah, I don't know. So I'm not really so much playing with the idea of the vampire, but the setting I think is a little different. And his goal is a little unusual. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. And I'm having a lot of fun with it.
That
Sounds
sounds
interesting, right?
yeah.
Definitely not a Y. It's definitely not a YA story.
No.
Yeah, no.
No. I don't write much YA. I've tried my hand, but I have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
Again, we talked a second ago, my vampires are sexy. All of our vampires have a little bit of sex appeal. It's kind of hard to translate YA. I don't know. For me, at least, it is.
Yeah. My vampires don't want to just hold hands. So.
You have got some great one-liners. Some fantastic ones. Oh my goodness. So, all right. So we talked a bunch about what we like to write, what we like to read, you know, what our vampires look like, what our vampires are interested in doing, and the scenarios they're doing it in. Any suggestions for books that people could read? Because, you know, it's interesting enough, you know, Dracula is the thing that comes to mind for people, but there's so much more out there. Like for me, if someone asked me this question, I would suggest Camilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Just all of the female vampire, probably the first one written down. Same-sex relationship. I'm like, the story is groundbreaking. Most people don't even know it exists.
Yeah.
You know? And or the Pale Lady, Alexander Dumas. Oh my gosh. Like what? So I mean, for me, yes, we could talk about current things, we could talk about recent things, sure. For me, when I started deciding that I was going to try my hand at a vampire, I read the older stuff. I read the classics. So what do you think is good to you? What would you suggest to someone who says, I want to read a really good vampire story?
So, you know, I like I said, I started reading Anne Rice when I was pretty young, but I did not see myself in any of her fiction. I don't see myself in a lot of vampire fiction until I read Joel Gomez's The Guild of Stories, and it's set sort of like around the time of the Civil War. It takes place in the Old West or the Midwest, and all of the main characters are women, and one is a slave, one is Native American, and it's a love story, and it's about vampires, and it is fantastic. And it was the first thing that I read that I could see myself in, and it kind of gave me the green light to write my own vampire fiction, and cast people that look like me. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend that. I don't know. I read so much that I always go blank whenever I try to think about what people should, you know, what I should recommend. But George R.R. Martin wrote a vampire novel a long time ago, and it's called Fever Dream. And I read it probably around the time that I was reading Anne Rice. And it's fantastic. And it every now and then it'll end up on, like, you'll see pop up on like a list of, you know, all the vampire novels you've never read or whatever. And so I would highly recommend it because it's a really good book. And it is very like old school vampire story. So it's a really good book. And it's George R.R. Martin, so you can't go wrong. Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
There's a short story from Angela Carter. It's in the Bloody Chamber, so her real famous collection. I believe it's called The Lady in the House of Leaves. and it's a vampire story, but it's a very like downtrodden vampire story, because she's just like very sad to be a vampire, and it's like this interesting kind of ennui of like how boring it would be, because like the town's basically died around her because she basically killed everybody. But you know, she looks very young. She looks maybe 14, 15, you know, and reminds me of I think, actually no, I think it might have been around the same time as Claudia from Interview with the Vampire, because that came out in the 70s, I think, the book.
Yeah.
This might have been around the same time, so they're like kind of at that. There can be a zeitgeist like that when you'll have things that are like the same coming out at the same time. But it's like she's very young. She's trapped in this body. She's trapped in this castle that's decaying around her. Every once in a while, some poor person will come into the area and they'll like get this guy or whatever. But it's so much about how unhappy she is with this kind of eternal life, and I always find that kind of almost like the existential elements of what being a vampire would be like, and how you would kind of have the mechanics of trying to live forever, and how hard I think that would be. And I liked your point about how very often they're very, very rich. But I almost think like over time, can you keep that wealth going, or would you almost start to extinguish it after a while? I don't know. Maybe you could keep it going, because you see these families that are rich for like generations. So clearly that's a thing that people can do. But like also the expense of having to hide the fact that it's still you. I mean, maybe that wouldn't have been such a thing like before now, but in the age of the internet, I always think like, how can a vampire get away with that? Like you have to have all these social security numbers. You got to get your license updated. And I a lot of times like things that deal with how hard it would be just to kind of exist as a vampire. So I really like that Angela Carter story. So that's one that I don't see people talk about it very often. People talk about the Bloody Chamber, but they often don't talk about that story. And I just think that one's like, I often think back to it and just think of her sitting in her castle. I think she's got little tarot cards that she like plays with, because she's so bored. She's always doing these tarot cards. So it's like just that kind of boredom of eternity.
It's funny you brought that up. I don't think about that, the Bloody Chamber, very often, but when I do, I get stuck on the story that's the rendition of Little Red Riding Hood.
Yes.
I'm just, yeah. I'm just like, okay, I can't. I read it. I remember it. I remember it too vividly. That's enough. Very nice. Well, you know, I think I have time for one more question. Unless Michelle, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to piggyback on that idea of the boredom of being a vampire. I think that one of the best examples that I've ever seen of that was Only Lovers Left Alive. So that just, it sort of like showed how you would be obsessed with like one thing for eternity. Like, you know, Tom Hiddleston's character loves music and he just collects albums, and Tilda Swinton has all these books, and they would be incredibly boring to talk to because that's all that they're interested in. So it was like a really cool interpretation of this is what it's like to live forever, and it's incredibly boring.
Wow.
So, yeah, I really loved it. I loved it.
That's very interesting.
I haven't seen that yet, but I've heard good things about it, so I'll need to check it out.
Definitely see it. Yeah.
I've got a list going of things we've discussed today. Things to read, things to watch. Okay, so my last question really is, what are you working on? I know, Michelle, you told us about the one within the adults, on the adult set. What are you guys working on in terms of vampire fiction right now? What's coming up now? Michelle, how are you still working on that story, or is it close to done, or is it subbed?
Yeah, it's going to be done soon because I had a breakthrough. I figured something out, and so I'm just like, oh yeah, okay, I can finally finish this thing. But I also have started working on the sequel to Invisible Chains, and spoiler alert, things are going to get really bad. So, but they're going to get bad enough that Jacqueline is going to have to, she's going to have to think about resurrecting Carlos. So yeah, so I'm working on that.
Excellent. Gwendolyn, what are you doing?
I'm actually, this is great, because like my next novel is going to actually be expanding on the Lucy retelling, and it's going to put her together with Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre's first wife, the woman that was kept away in the attic. So they're friends, and Rochester and Dracula are basically kind of following them through time, and we find them in the 1960s. and kind of like the tumult of the 1960s. That's when it all comes to a head. So I'm very excited. Like, 'cause I love it. Like I said, I love the character of Lucy, and I love Jane Eyre, but it's one of those, it's another thing that, like, I loved when I was younger and I thought it was so romantic, and now that I'm older, I'm like, it's really not that romantic, he's really quite terrible. And so it's just kind of revisiting and realizing, like, oh, these things I was told were really romantic when I was young, maybe not. So, like, like revisiting that, which is always an interesting thing. I think that can be so interesting. You know, you're told these fairy tales are so romantic when you're young, and you're like, you get older and you're like, they're pretty terrible, you know, pretty scary. So, but it makes for great horror, right? Like, it's ready-made horror.
Nice way to look at it. Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. That kind of reminds me of that. Was it an HBO special that did something like that? It was oh my goodness! It was like you had Dracula, you had Frankenstein, you had.
Oh yes, Penny Dreadful, right?
Penny Dreadful.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. That sounds like so much fun.
So good.
Luck with those two. Yeah, just to jump in on that, I'm working on something. Well, actually, no, I'm not. I finished working on it. It should be out soon, so it's exciting. I have a short story in the anthologies called Slay, coming out from Mocha Memoirs Press. It should be out in like a month, actually, October. And Michelle, when you talked about playing with setting, I did that in mine. Because I mean, there's but so much you can do. So I try to, my setting is, you know, my character's walking in, and she, unbeknownst to her, she's going to be attracted to a vampire dancing on the floor, but they're at the club, like bass drum music going, you know, reggae beats. And this is where she's encountering her vampiric experience. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to write.
That's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's cool. You guys, thank you so much for spending time with me today and having this discussion about vampires. I mean, honestly, I was blown away with the intellectual bent we went on for a little while there. Only to come back, of course, and speak about sex. As you know, women are getting together, we're having a conversation, and that's where we ended up. It's a vampire discussion. But anyway, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Absolutely, it was great.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this panel, head over to our StoryFest 2020 playlist and check out the rest of our virtual author events. And for more information about StoryFest, visit the library's website at www.westportlibrary.org.